Lower Saxony, British occupation zone, September 1946. Rain poured relentlessly across the heath, turning the compound into a muddy expanse under a slate-gray sky that seemed to stretch endlessly toward a horizon no one could fully discern. The women's camp lay just outside Hanover, a series of Nissen huts arranged with geometric precision that reflected British military efficiency, surrounded by barbed wire maintained with the same meticulous care that characterized everything the British did. Annalisa, 28, a former clerk in the Luftwaffe Communications Division who had spent the final years of the war filing reports she no longer believed mattered, stood in the assembly hall alongside 189 other German women, all waiting for an announcement that felt different from the usual roster calls and work assignments. The camp commandant, Colonel Henry Dalton from Yorkshire, had ordered all women to assemble after the midday meal. It was highly irregular. The British ran their operations with clockwork precision, and deviations from routine were rare enough to inspire unease. There was something in the air today, a kind of nervous tension among the guards, the way they stood slightly more rigidly than usual, and the way senior staff clustered near the platform, conferring in low voices. Annalisa felt her chest tighten. She had learned over months in the camp that when the British altered their routines, it usually signaled something significant beyond the fence, in the broader machinery of occupation that governed their lives. Around her, women whispered in German, their voices weaving a hum of speculation beneath the drumming of rain on the corrugated roof. Rumors had circulated for weeks. They were being transferred to work camps in Belgium to clear rubble, sent to Scotland to labor on farms, or repatriated, though few believed it. Germany was now divided, carved among the victors, and returning home meant facing occupation zones in cities reduced to ruins. Annalisa had arrived at this camp in June, transferred from a larger detention facility after a British officer noted her fluency in English during a routine interview. She had learned English from her grandmother, who had lived in London before the First War and had taught her careful pronunciation and grammar. That skill had kept her alive in the final collapse of the Reich, made her valuable to the British administration, and secured her placement in this particular camp rather than somewhere worse. She had never expected to survive the war. As Germany crumbled around her and Allied forces closed in, she had assumed death would come suddenly, violently, as it had for so many others. Instead, she had surrendered to British soldiers in May 1945, been processed through a detention center in Hamburg, and found herself in this strange limbo, where the war had ended but its consequences unfolded with bureaucratic slowness. Colonel Dalton stepped forward, and the assembled women fell silent, a reflex born of months of British supervision. He was tall, perhaps in his late 50s, bearing the weight of 2 wars in the lines of his face. Several folders were clutched under his arm, and his expression was carefully neutral, the countenance of a man about to deliver information he had not entirely chosen. "I am going to explain a situation to you," he began, his English clipped and precise in the manner of a certain class of British officer. A translator, Greta, a former teacher from Berlin, repeated his words in German, though many women understood English well enough to follow. "The war has concluded. You have been detained and processed according to international law and the terms of the German surrender. You have been provided with accommodation, sustenance, and medical care as required by the Geneva Convention. However, your status remains that of civilian internees awaiting final disposition. The British government is now determining what that disposition shall be." Annalisa held her breath. Something was coming, something that would change everything. "Britain requires labor for reconstruction," Dalton continued. "Your nation participated in the destruction of much of Europe. Europe must now be rebuilt. His Majesty's government is prepared to offer contracts to women willing to participate in organized work programs. These contracts will be administered through the Ministry of Labor and provide wages, housing, and conditions appropriate to civilian workers. You will work where British authorities assign you. Your status will change from internee to contracted laborer." A murmur ran through the crowd. Work contracts suggested a form of freedom, even if limited and conditional. "However," Dalton said, his tone shifting, more measured now, "there is an additional matter to address. A number of British servicemen stationed in this region have inquired about the possibility of forming attachments with women currently detained here." The hall fell utterly silent, the rain seeming to pause in the heavy air. "These inquiries have been reviewed by military legal counsel and civilian authorities. While unusual, such attachments are not strictly prohibited under current regulations. Marriage between British subjects and German nationals is legal, though subject to significant restrictions and approval by military authorities." Annalisa felt the words settle over her like frost, obscuring everything that had seemed clear moments before. Marriage, the concept seemed impossible, incomprehensible, like asking a woman to dissolve into smoke. Dalton continued, the following procedure will be implemented. Any woman wishing to be considered for a work contract may volunteer. Additionally, any woman willing to receive a proposal of marriage from a British serviceman may indicate her willingness. Those women will be granted supervised meetings with interested servicemen. You will hear their proposals and accept or decline as you see fit. What you cannot do is remain in this camp indefinitely. This facility will be decommissioned by February 1947. All women must either accept work contracts, arrange for repatriation to their appropriate zones in Germany, or, if applicable, complete marriage proceedings with approved British subjects. A marriage receiving official approval will result in immediate transfer to British civilian custody with housing and treatment equivalent to that of a dependent of a British subject. Colonel Dalton looked across the assembled women, expression controlled. I want to be entirely clear, he said. No woman will be forced into marriage. No woman will face punishment for refusing a proposal. This is being offered as an option, nothing more. However, those who decline both work contracts and marriage proposals will be subject to repatriation proceedings which may result in transfer to zones under different occupation authorities. The choice within these parameters is yours. He turned and walked out, followed by the other officers before anyone could formulate questions, though no one was quite certain what questions to ask. That night, the Nissan huts erupted in anxious conversation. Women who had maintained careful distance throughout months of detention suddenly clustered together, their voices rising and falling in urgent debate. Some insisted this was a trap, another form of humiliation designed to degrade them further. Others whispered that it might represent an opportunity, a way out of the grinding uncertainty of displacement. A few, the practical ones, began calculating odds, weighing options, trying to determine which path led towards survival. Anala sat on her bunk and thought about the towel the British had issued her when she first arrived at the camp. It had been clean, regulation white, precisely folded. She had been told to wash daily, given soap that actually layered, provided with facilities that worked. The British were not cruel, but they were exacting. Everything had rules, procedures, proper forms to be filled out in triplicate. This announcement fit that pattern. Even marriage, it seemed, would be administered with bureaucratic precision. She thought about what marriage meant. She had been engaged before the war to a boy named Heinrich who had died in France in 1940. She had loved him with the certainty of youth, with the assumption that futures were guaranteed and love was permanent. When the telegram came, she had mourned him, but she had also been released from expectations, freed someone other than Heinrich's wife. The idea of marrying now in detention to a stranger from the nation that had bombed her cities seemed like a betrayal of something she could not quite name. And yet remaining felt equally impossible. Repatriation meant returning to a Germany that no longer existed, to a Soviet zone or an American zone or a French zone, each with its own rules and dangers. The next morning, Annalisa was not scheduled for any meetings. Most women were not. Colonel Dalton's announcement had created complications that the British military establishment had apparently not fully anticipated. The servicemen who had made inquiries, it turned out, were fewer in number than the administration had perhaps expected, and those who had expressed interest were discovering that the reality of actually proposing to a German woman, of contemplating marriage to someone from the enemy nation, was considerably more complex than abstract interest had suggested. By the third day, only 18 women had been offered proposals. Some had accepted. A dark-haired woman named Frida from Dresden had agreed to marry a sergeant named William Campbell, a Scotsman whose own family had been killed in the Blitz, and who seemed to be seeking something Annalisa could not quite understand, some form of forgiveness or connection that transcended national boundaries. They looked at each other with a kind of desperate recognition, as though both understood they were refugees seeking shelter in an arrangement that made no sense to anyone else. Others had refused. A woman named Helga, who had worked as a nurse during the war, and had seen more death than most, had turned down 2 proposals without hesitation. I did not survive the war to become a British soldier's wife, she had said loudly enough for others to hear. I am German. That will not change regardless of whom I marry. By the second week, Annalisa had begun to think she might avoid the marriage system entirely. She was not beautiful. In the obvious way some women were, and her English, while fluent, seemed to make her less exotic somehow, more like an interpreter than a romantic possibility. She had resigned herself to accepting a work contract, to becoming a laborer in some British reconstruction project, when on a Tuesday morning in October, she was called to the administration building. She expected Colonel Dalton, but instead found a different officer, younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with fair hair and an expression that suggested competing thoughts held in careful balance. His name was Captain Thomas Harding, stationed with a civil affairs unit in Hamburg, working on displaced persons and reconstruction administration. He had served in the war as an intelligence officer, had seen combat in North Africa and Italy, and had decided after the war ended that he would remain in Germany to help manage the aftermath, rather than return immediately to his law practice in London. "I'm not here to propose marriage," he said before Annalisa could even process why she had been summoned. "I need to be clear about that from the start." Annalisa felt something she could not quite identify, relief mixed with something else, something that might have been disappointment. "Then why am I here, sir?" she asked in English. "I've been reviewing camp records," Thomas said. "I've read your file. You were a clerk in communications. You speak fluent English. You have education beyond what most of the women here received. I'm working on a project in Hamburg, coordinating between British administration and German civilian authorities. We need translators, people who understand both how the British system works and how German civilians think and operate. I'm wondering if you would be interested in that kind of work, as part of a work contract," Anna asked carefully. "Yes, but more specialized than the standard labor contracts. You would be classified as administrative staff, work directly with civil affairs officers, receive better wages and housing than standard laborers. You would have considerably more independence than most contracted workers, and if I accept, you would be transferred to Hamburg, assigned to our civil affairs office, given accommodation in a building leave requisitioned for administrative staff. You would work as a liaison and translator between British authorities and German civilian workers. Help us understand local conditions. Help local Germans understand what we require. You would be paid in British military script, which can be exchanged for marks or saved. You would have the freedom to move within designated zones. Considerably more autonomy than you have here. It sounds, Annalisa said carefully, almost too good to be true. Thomas smiled slightly. It probably is in some respects. The work will be difficult. You will be caught between two sides, neither of which will entirely trust you, but it is what I'm offering. What you do with the offer is entirely your decision. Annalisa accepted. For days later, she left the camp not as a bride, and not as a repatriated intern, but as something unexpected, a worker with specialized skills, a woman choosing her own path through the complicated terrain of occupied Germany. The work in Hamburg was harder than she had anticipated. The city was a landscape of ruins, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, the harbor choked with sunken ships, the population struggling to survive in cellars and makeshift shelters. The British Civil Affairs Office operated out of a requisition building that had somehow survived mostly intact, coordinating relief efforts, managing displaced persons, trying to establish some form of functioning administration in the chaos. Annalisa found herself translating not just words, but entire systems of meaning, helping British officers understand why German civilians approach problems in certain ways, helping German workers understand what the British required and why. It was exhausting, frustrating work, caught constantly between competing expectations and mutual suspicion. It was in November during one of these translation sessions that she met Friedrich. He was not a British officer or a German civilian worker. He was something in between, a German doctor who had been conscripted late in the war, had served on the Eastern Front and had survived by being skilled enough and lucky enough to avoid death. He had returned to Hamburg to find his medical practice destroyed, his family scattered, his entire world reduced to ruins. Now he worked with the British Medical Services, helping coordinate healthcare for displaced persons and the civilian population. He was perhaps 45 with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen things that made his gaze seem to exist at a slight distance from the present moment. The first time they had a substantial conversation, it was because a conflict had erupted over the distribution of medical supplies. The British wanted to centralize distribution through their own channels. Friedrich insisted that local German doctors needed direct access to supplies to treat patients effectively. Tell him that centralized distribution ensures proper allocation, the British medical officer, Major Thornton, said to Annalisa. She translated, but Friedrich's response was more complex than simple disagreement. Tell him that centralized distribution ensures control, not proper allocation. The people dying of typhus in the cellars of Altona do not benefit from supplies sitting in a warehouse waiting for proper documentation. Major Thornton looked irritated. Friedrich waited. Annalisa found herself in the strange position of agreeing with Friedrich but understanding Thornton's constraints. Dr. Friedrich suggests Annalisa translated carefully that perhaps a hybrid system could work. Centralized control with delegated distribution authority to qualified local medical personnel. That way the British maintain oversight but supplies reach patients more efficiently. Something in how she said it made Friedrich look at her differently. After that, he began to seek her out during breaks, not asking her to translate, but simply to talk. He asked her where she had come from, what she had done during the war, whether she thought Germany would ever recover from what had been done and what had been done to it. I think Germany will recover, Annalisa answered honestly. But I think we will become something different. We cannot return to what we were. That's a dangerous thing to say to a stranger, Friedrich replied. Perhaps, Annalisa said, but you asked for honesty, not safety. By December, they were having real conversations. Friedrich had lost his wife and daughter in the bombing of Hamburg in 1943, the firestorm that had killed tens of thousands in a single night. He had been at the front when it happened, had learned about it weeks later through a Red Cross notification. He lived now in a partially destroyed apartment building in Eppendorf, heated by a small stove, furnished with salvaged remnants of what had been his life. I shouldn't be talking to you like this, he said one day. You work for the British. I work for the British. We're both compromised in ways that make this complicated. I'm not sure anything isn't complicated now, Annalise replied. We're all compromised. We're all just trying to survive in circumstances none of us chose. You're very practical for someone your age. The war taught me to be practical. Annalisa said practicality was the price of survival. Friedrich smiled slightly. Yes, I understand that. In January 1947, when the camp was officially decommissioned and the remaining women were processed into work contracts or repatriation, Annalise was no longer there to witness it. She had moved into a small room in the requisitioned building in Hamburg with other administrative staff, had received her first proper wages, had begun the strange process of building a life that existed in the spaces between British control and German survival. Friedrich continued to work with the medical services, continued to seek out Annalisa during their overlapping schedules. Other people noticed. Some British officers made comments that were not entirely kind. Some German civilians looked at her with suspicion, seeing her as someone who had chosen the occupiers over her own people, but no one stopped it. In March, Friedrich asked her to marry him. It was not a romantic proposal. He explained it practically the way he explained most medical procedures. I am alone, he said. You are alone. Hamburg is destroyed but being rebuilt. We are both trying to survive in a city that barely exists. I think we could help each other survive. I think we understand each other in ways that would be difficult to explain to anyone else. I am not offering you romance. I am offering you partnership in survival. Annalisa considered this for a long moment. She had not expected to marry again, had not expected to marry at all after Heinrich. But Friedrich was right. They understood each other. They had both seen enough of war and death to have no illusions about what life required. Yes, she said finally. On one condition, we marry as equals. I am not your dependent. I am your partner. I continue my work. I maintain my independence. We build something together, not something where I simply become an extension of your life. Agreed, Friedrich said, that is exactly what I want as well. They were married in May 1947, a quiet civil ceremony at a Hamburg registry office, with 2 colleagues as witnesses. There was no church, no family, none of the traditional elements that would have accompanied a German wedding before the war. It was simply administrative, the way everything in the post-war world had become administrative. Annalisa wrote to her brother, who had survived the war and was living in the British zone in the Rhineland, explaining what she had done. She wrote to the International Red Cross with information about other women from the camp, documenting what had happened. Creating a record. She understood that history was being written by those who could document their own experiences. And she wanted her version to exist, but the most important writing was in her journal, which she kept in German, a private record of her thoughts and observations. I was detained by the British and offered marriage by British soldiers, she wrote in June 1947. I chose neither. I chose work, independence, the possibility of building my own life. And then, when I was free to choose for myself, I chose Friedrich, not because I needed rescue, but because I wanted partnership. The British system, for all its rules and procedures, allowed me to refuse their offers and make my own choice. That is not freedom, not in any absolute sense, but it is something closer to agency than I expected to find in defeat. Other women from the camp had made different choices. Frida, the woman who had married Sergeant Campbell, had moved with him to Scotland, where she was learning to navigate a culture entirely foreign to her, trying to build a life in a place where many people still hated Germans. She wrote to Anneliese occasionally, letters that described both the difficulties and the unexpected kindnesses she had found. Helga, who had refused all marriage proposals, had been repatriated to the Soviet zone, where she was working as a nurse in Berlin. Her letters were more guarded, more careful, but she wrote that she had made the right choice for herself, that she would rather face the hardships of the Soviet zone as a free German woman than live comfortably as a British soldier's wife. News filtered back through various channels. Some marriages had worked, others had fallen apart quickly. Women who had married to escape detention sometimes discovered that marriage to a stranger was its own form of captivity. Divorces were beginning to happen, though they were complicated by the legal tangles of occupation law. But the system itself, the strange machinery that Colonel Dalton had implemented, had done what bureaucracies sometimes do. It had created unintended opportunities by offering marriage as an option rather than imposing it, by allowing women to refuse, by creating space for different kinds of choices. The British had inadvertently created conditions where some women could exercise limited agency. Annalisa had been fortunate, though she did not think of it as luck. She thought of it as having skills the occupation needed and having the intelligence to translate those skills into opportunity. By the summer of 1947, she had stopped thinking of herself as a former intern. She was a worker, a translator, a wife, a woman building a life in a city, rebuilding itself. The occupation was becoming normalized. The question of who she had been during the war was slowly being replaced by the question of who she would become in whatever Germany emerged from the ruins. Friedrich's nephew, Peter, arrived in Hamburg in August. He was 16, thin and haunted. His parents dead in the war, no other family remaining. Friedrich had not seen him in 4 years. The three of them stood in the small apartment, uncertain how to become a family. My uncle says you chose to marry him, Peter said in careful English. That you were not forced. That's correct, Annalisa said. I was offered many options. I chose to work first to become independent. Then I chose your uncle because I believed we could build something honest together. Peter nodded slowly. My uncle is a good man. He saved many people during the war. I think you made a good choice. I think so too, Annalise said. In September, on the first anniversary of Colonel Dalton's announcement, Anna thought about the women who had made different choices, the women who had married British soldiers to escape, the women who had been repatriated, the women who had disappeared into work contracts and had not been heard from since. She thought about the fundamental strangeness of the situation, the way defeat had created conditions under which marriage became an option rather than an obligation, a choice rather than an inevitability. She thought about what it meant that the British had allowed this, that they had not prevented marriages, but had also not forced them, had created a bureaucratic framework that acknowledged
both control and consent.
She understood this was not because the British were inherently more humane than other powers. It was simply that their particular form of administration, their obsession with proper procedure and legal correctness, had created spaces where agency could sometimes emerge. Years later, Annalisa would tell this story to her son, born in 1950, a child with his father's serious expression and her pragmatic
temperament.
"I was detained after the war," she would say, "and the British offered me choices. Not unlimited choices, not freedom in the way we think of it now, but genuine choices nonetheless. I chose to work rather than to marry. I chose to build independence rather than to seek security through a British husband. And then when I had built that independence, I chose to marry a German man who understood what I had survived and what I wanted to become." "But you were still under British control," her son would say.
Yes, Annalisa would agree.
"But within that control, there were spaces where I could choose, and those spaces made all the difference."
The occupation continued for years. Slowly, German sovereignty was restored, though always partially, always conditionally.
The work contracts became regular employment.
The reconstruction projects became businesses.
The displaced persons camps closed and their populations moved forward or moved
back depending on where they could go.